Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our session. Instead of this session being called Between Two Ferns with Zach Galifianakis and Mr. Galifianakis, if I'm mispronouncing your name, apologies if you're watching this in between recording your movies. We're going to call this session Between Two Amelias because I am joined by two Amelias. Amelia Greenberg from the Social Performance Task Force. We will refer to her as Amelia G, as well as Amelia Kuplowitz from Grameen Foundation, and she's going to be referred to as Amelia K. So the topic we're going to explore today, and the title of this session is called Kids in the Crosshairs, the Nexus Between Financial Inclusion and Child Protection. So on one hand, you're probably wondering, have I joined a therapy session where a bunch of moms are going to talk about children being in their hair all day? Or you might be wondering, is this a session about financial services and how they can inadvertently cause child labor? So if you chose the second one, you'd be right, but we're probably going to touch on both topics. But let's get serious. So this session wants to cover a topic that financial service practitioners generally don't spend a lot of time talking about, and that's child labor. But to get to the topic of child labor, we have to start earlier and talk about the unintended consequences of financial inclusion and the importance of doing no harm as we aim to do good with financial services. So we're going to start off with Amelia G from the SPTF. Recently, you guys started revising the universal standards, and one of the revisions that has been made is a deeper emphasis on do no harm or the unintended consequences of financial services. But before you share about these revisions, I'd like to see if you can share a little bit more about the universal standards themselves, especially for those who may be new to this topic.
Yeah, so welcome everyone. I can talk about either kids in my crosshairs or kids in financial inclusion. So we'll start with the latter. The universal standards has a long full name. It's the Universal Standards for Social and Environmental Performance Management. We call them the Universal Standards for short, and it's a manual that presents a comprehensive set of management standards that apply to all financial service providers that have social goals. And although SPTF manages the document, we keep track of good practices and we publish it and we update it. It's actually written not by us, but by all of our stakeholders of all types in the inclusive finance sector. The practices themselves are for financial service providers of all sizes and legal types and geographies. And the value of this manual is that it identifies in one place all of the essential management practices that a financial service provider has to have in place in order to manage its social performance as professionally and effectively as it does its financial performance. And I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the broad dimensions around which we organize the universal standards. So this is how the manual is organized. We have management practices that fall under Dimension 1, social strategy. The second dimension is committed leadership. The third dimension is client-centered products and services. The fourth dimension is client protection. The fifth is responsible human resource development. The sixth is responsible growth and returns. And the seventh, which is now mandatory, used to be optional, is environmental performance management. So if you take this entire wheel, you take all our dimensions, you read all the practices within each one, you get this comprehensive understanding of what management practices you need to have in place in order to do no harm and to achieve the social goals that you've set for yourself. And even financial service providers that don't come from a background of an NGO or a really social place, still we find in this sector an increasing commitment to creating some sort of value for your clients. So even if you would define yourself as an organization that wants to be financially sustainable, but also put a product out in the market that's actually useful for the clients who use it, these standards would apply to you.
Great, Amelia. I think that's really helpful. And given I'm aware that you guys have been going through a year-long process to revise the standards. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what has changed, especially, related to this conversation about do no harm or the unintended consequences of financial services.
Yeah, so that's been a really interesting part of this revision process. SPTF reviews the standards about every 5 years because we want to make sure that they continue to reflect best practice. And part of our review, core to our review process, is inviting, as I said, all of our stakeholders to participate. And so when we did this time, we started these interesting conversations with Grameen that had been doing a lot of research about unintended negative consequences that do happen in the financial inclusion sector. And what we learned is that sometimes the behaviors of the financial service provider in terms of what products they offer, and especially with loan products, how they enforce their rules around repayment and whether they offer rescheduling and things like that, can have these unintended direct ties to sort of negative effects both on the household and on the client. And so we incorporated some of that learning in 2 main dimensions: in dimension 1, which is the social strategy, and in dimension 3, which is client-centered products and services. If I get really specific, I would say in dimension 1, the social strategy used to and still does talk about having a very clearly defined strategy to achieve your goals. And that strategy needs to include not only what those goals are, but also who in particular your target clients are, and what products and services you're going to offer, and this idea of how what you do will contribute to those benefits that you're trying to create. And what we've added this time is saying that in addition, the provider needs to define within that overall strategy, it's defining not only how it's going to do good, but also a do no harm strategy that will articulate how it will, its operations and its strategic decisions and its products and services and everything it does to interact with clients and understand what is happening in their lives. It will articulate how those processes mitigate some of these risks that are connected to the use of products and services that research has shown us, unfortunately, can be very real. And so when we get into the details of the assessment tool, we mention the specific types of negative outcomes that we sometimes see. And some of those are corruption and bribery or human rights violations, but we now have also a detail about negative effects on clients' households. So that element of being very deliberate in your strategy about articulating what you'll do to mitigate those risks is a new revision. And then also still within dimension 1, but under the standards, we have one standard about setting your strategy, and then we have a second standard about collecting data that allows the FSP to monitor whether it's implementing its strategy. And in there, we have an indicator saying that the provider should collect data on an ongoing basis to measure whether it's achieving its social goals. And then the way that you would do that is explained a little more in the details. And one is saying you should collect quantitative data that measures both positive and negative changes for clients in their households. And then the second saying also investigate that in a qualitative way. So previously we were focusing more like on using indicators that measure whether you're achieving your goals. And now we have this idea of positive and negative need to be aspects of your outcomes that you're investigating, and also the inclusion of the word households and not just for the clients is part of the revision, the most recent revision. And then when we get to dimension 3, which is client-centered products and services, one of the standards there is the provider collects and analyzes data to understand clients' needs. And within that, we have a practice saying that you should collect feedback from your clients on their experiences using the products and services. And there are different ways that providers do that. And for example, a client satisfaction survey, you can conduct exit interviews with clients who no longer are clients of your institution. But we have an indicator now that says, in addition to doing those types of more commonly understood data collection processes, the provider should also investigate specifically whether stresses at the household level have made it more difficult for clients to use products and services. And this is something that's kind of a hidden stress and unintended negative consequence often if you just look at quantitative data, because it is quite possible for someone to take out a loan and repay it on time, and you would never know what had to happen in order for that to take place. So maybe everything was great and she just repaid it, or maybe it was enormously stressful. And the stress can come not just from the specific topic we're going to talk about today, like maybe there was a shock in the household or someone got sick and she had to take her child out of school to help get a job, to help repay. So that's one kind of negative. But you can even have a stress more from just a human interaction level, like my spouse doesn't like it, but now I have an independent source of money and I'm getting a little more economic empowerment, and or maybe I'm part of a program that caters to women and now my spouse feels left out, or just even if its spouse is supportive and the kids are fine, if the woman is feeling like, I didn't know how stressful it was going to be to have to manage this loan. This is all information that we think a financial service provider should have. So that's why that indicator is written a little more generally, as just investigate what their experience was using your product. But certainly within that, you could get feedback if there was an effect on the children, and that kind of level of change in their household that should come out through investigating any kind of stress that the client experienced. So those are the two major areas, and it's a topic I could talk about all day, but we've got other things to get to, so I'll kick it back to you, Bobby.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think it's interesting to think about how some of this work that the SPTF has been doing, around unintended consequences is really kind of a multi-year conversation that has been going on about measuring outcomes and paying attention to what was the work under CGAP, I'm blanking on the name of the efforts that Anton Simanowicz and the client, oh my gosh, why am I blanking?
Empowerment, is that what you're talking
about? Yeah, the client empowerment measures, like really going beyond are people accessing and using services, but what is that immediate interaction? Like, do they really know where to go to get help? And what is their experience? Do they feel like they're respected by their provider? Like, it's all kind of culminating in some of the revisions that you guys, have made to the standards. Is really great to see.
And I would say just one last thing on what's changed is that we really have tried to focus these revisions with a lens of what is useful for the financial service provider. And I think outcomes used to be more like, we're going to prove to our donors that we're saving the world. And in our current iteration, we're really thinking about what information do you need to have in order to manage yourself sustainably, both financially and well socially. And this issue of, are you stressing out your clients? Are you causing these unintended negative consequences in their household? Does have financial implications. And not only that, but there are, as we're going to hear, some practices that a financial service provider, within the narrow scope of what they do, just their product design and their offer, can really mitigate some of those risks. So it's been a learning process for sure to get to this, I think, stronger and better focus on just what does the FSP itself need to know to run its business sustainably and for the benefit of clients.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So now I'd like to turn to Amelia Kay. So besides managing Grameen's Latin American and Asian portfolios, a very small task, of course, to have 2 regions of the world under your responsibility. You also lead Grameen's Richest Project. Can you share a little bit about this project and kind of how it relates to the topic that we've been discussing so far about unintended consequences of financial services?
Thanks, Bobby. All in a day's work. Couldn't do it without you as my sidekick. So the Richest Project is really focused on really looking at this intersection. And so there has been some evidence that's come out over the years of, as Amelia Kay mentioned, unintended negative consequences. And specifically, the project is looking at how financial service providers could be increasing both child labor as well as negative working conditions, unacceptable working conditions, whether for children or for the women entrepreneurs themselves. And so really, over the course of a handful of years, we've been diving very deep to see what is going on a field level, how much awareness is there within financial service providers, and understanding if there have been any experiences, which we've seen is only a handful of really being able to look at specifically this specific unintended negative consequence. And so, where the project is focusing on is really to create a toolkit for we actors. And we use kind of this very umbrella term of women's economic empowerment actors. So whether you're working in livelihoods, whether you're an FSP, a microfinance institution, an NGO, even policymakers, there's tools for this wide audience of people, because we recognize that women's economic empowerment comes in kind of different ways. And so the toolkit is kind of focused around, three main areas. One of the pieces that we really came to appreciate was lack of awareness, as well as I would call it confusion about what exactly is child labor and what is unacceptable working conditions. So there's a handful of tools that are really focused on building a management level awareness and understanding the organizational risks. And so kind of what Amelia Kay was talking about is really understanding that exposure. If we're not asking about it, if we're not checking on our portfolio, then it's going to be really hard to understand specifically how exposed or how much risk either women are facing or the organization is facing. Then there's a whole other set of tools for field level staff. So thinking about your credit officers, your community agents, those who have that role and play a nexus between clients and the institution to help build their awareness and be a little bit more of a empowered advocate in understanding, the different resources in the community or the risks that women entrepreneurs are facing. And then a whole other set of tools that are really focused on participant level, client, beneficiary, whatever word you prefer to use, building their awareness and supporting their needs through training, through inter-household dialogues and some risk assessments as well for them, so that they're able to really work on that level of participants. We've organized them kind of in three different phases, and we're promoting phase one as kind of the minimum standards that any organization really can implement. And we're taking a social performance management approach to that, to really say that, these are basics that build into business practices and good practices and things that you can really easily work on a management level before moving on to those other two levels. So phase two is much more focused on field staff awareness, and then just getting to phase three is when we really involve participants.
Great. No, I think that's helpful. And, as you think about the experience that you've had so far, so I have kind of two questions for you. The first question is, some of what I know about the Richest Project is, really kind of helping build FSP awareness of the trade-offs that women are making, especially because they're in childbearing years most of the time when they're starting businesses, and kind of the caretaking and kind of share the care responsibilities that women are seeking as they build businesses. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, as well as, as you've been building the toolkit, what do you think has been harder, building the toolkit itself or garnering that support and interest to consider child labor as an unintended consequence of, providing financial services?
Great, absolutely. Thanks, Bobby. Yeah, that question about trade-offs is really, really great. And so, what the evidence is showing is that as a woman is growing her business, and as she is, focusing on that economic aspect, it is almost often coinciding with her childbearing years and coinciding with caretaking, and even now a double burden of taking care of children as well as elderly parents in some cases. And so really that management and that trade-off and the balancing act that women are facing is, one of those really important drivers. And oftentimes they are turning to their children who are often brought to the workplace because caretaking isn't great or available or economical. And so, they end up coming to the business, and also because of kind of labor constraints or not being able to hire, part-time, full-time employees, whatever they may be, turning to those children as kind of that temporary labor source. And so really it's, that's the challenge, and that's the trade-off that, if there's a message for financial service providers, it's really to recognize that that's a very real pressure and sacrifice in some cases that women are making. To your second question, I think between designing the tools and convincing FSPs, we've gone through a whole process. We've talked to a lot of organizations, and really I would say definitely convincing FSPs that not only that this is an issue, but also really combating some of the myths between the difference of child labor and child work. And so, a lot of organizations have told us that, culturally, this is seen as something positive, around the world. Our research and our piloting, was in over 12 countries. And so culturally, we would be told that it's part of their formation. It's a way to make sure that there aren't idle hands, or that they're learning a skill or a trade that can serve them later on in life. And so that was, one of the messages that we've been hearing. And then kind of this recognition of, yes, we've seen child labor, but no, it's not child labor. Kind of, FSPs being, folks who go out into the field saying, yes, we've seen the child on the side of the road, or we've seen the child using a machete, and those sorts of pieces, which in the end kind of get to that crossing of the line. And so as you'll see, not to diminish the whole toolkit and all the work that was put into that, because that was, a huge effort in design. You'll notice that a lot of our tools are focused on that awareness building piece. So that's why we have a number of tools that are for management level, for staff who are working in SPM, for staff who are working in risk analysis, for our field staff, and as well as clients, so that, we are talking about when does it cross the line. And I think that that's, a lot of our message is that we recognize that this will never be a perfect issue. And because poverty is a driver of child labor, we're just trying to move the needle so that not only organizations, but women entrepreneurs can really distinguish, when is it that I'm crossing over to child labor? What are things that are beneficial and can be okay for kids, but then what are those steps, whether it's the conditions, whether it's the hours, or not being able to attend school, that really cross that line and help people move back from that.
Great. No, I think that's helpful. And, Amelia G as, Amelia K, and I was almost going to draw everybody's attention to the confusion that one feels when you are sitting between two Amelias, and sometimes they can't even remember how to refer to themselves in the conversation. Amelia G from the SPTF, as Amelia K was talking about kind of some of these preliminary findings that we have from engaging with FSPs on child labor, I'd love for you to also, we've kind of been on parallel tracks where the SPTF has been revising standards, and we've been thinking about how to make child labor or child protection an SPM or client protection issue, and how do we use SPM as a way for practitioners to see a practical way forward. And I just wonder, as you've looked at the revision of the standards, what do you see as the potential challenges or benefits for organizations as they consider these new standards on do no harm or unintended consequences?
Yeah, I think I could have guessed what Amelia Kay was going to say, is that it is definitely harder to get people to start doing it than it is to do the research. And it really is because this goes beyond financial inclusion, just life. Like, everybody's already so busy and they're doing their best. And you're like, you could do one more thing. No one's going to be like, great, let's add to my to-do list. So that is the number one challenge, I would say, is anytime you're saying, what else would be great, they're going to be like, ugh. So we do have to overcome that. And I think you just start by saying, look, I know you're busy, and we need to find a way to make this actionable that is really affordable and not really changing your workload, and also then to make the case for why it's relevant. So certainly more specific to this particular project, I would say some initial misconceptions can be, why is this the responsibility of a financial service provider? Like, we're not going to change the culture in our country, and we know how to make loans. We're not going to tell a mom like what she should do with her kids. But I think what the point of the Grameen research is that no, we are not at all saying financial service providers need to go tackle the culture in their country. But what their research found that was so connected to our standards is that there are certain existing practices by financial service providers that can either mitigate or exacerbate this risk. And certainly the biggest one is just how you help your clients respond to shock. So every financial service provider has clients that experience shock. They experience internal to the family, like injury or illness or death even, and then the external ones like drought and civil unrest. And when you have that, if your financial service provider has tools to help with shock. So if you were offering insurance, for example, and then there was crop failure, this isn't as devastating for the clients. Or if you have an emergency loan product, then when something comes up unexpected, the clients have access to that and they can cope. And the child labor is really it's a coping strategy for these negative events. So another issues that the research highlighted was aggressive loan recovery. Very aggressive can lead to sort of intimidation and distress, and then you might ultimately resort to child labor in order to do that. So we're not talking to FSPs about cultural awareness raising sessions. We're just saying, do you have ethical loan recovery practices in place? Do you offer financial products and services that help clients cope with shock? Do you offer loan rescheduling to good clients and make a distinction between when someone's unwilling to repay or unable to repay? And so then we can situate this discussion back into why we're talking about this in the context of financial inclusion. But that is an initial challenge, is this isn't my job. And then the other thing is just that, okay, now even if I buy in, like I don't have the money and I don't have the time. And I think when we are thinking about how to make this actionable, we really want to say, think of your existing touch points and your existing interactions with your clients. So if you're already doing satisfaction surveys, just add this question. If you're already doing focus groups, if you're doing market research, that's a time to say, what are just exploring obstacles and needs anyway to access to financial services. So we're not saying create a new division, create another survey that you have to do, create specialized data analysis. It's really just, it's actually pretty basic to ask clients what's going on in your life. And the nice thing about this is that you want to give the staff enough direction to say, look, you should be exploring negative as well as positive consequences, but it's really that same open-ended question. So that's going to get you all sorts of information, what's good, what's not good. And it could bring out the child labor issue in particular, but those same questions could bring out other problems or interesting activities that you should know about. So I would say those are the challenges. And then obviously the benefit is you don't want to be unwillingly contributing to negative effects for children, of course. And if you can do your part not to do that, you should morally, but also from a financial sustainability perspective. Certainly, if your clients find it stressful or difficult or ultimately negative for their household to participate in using your products and services, they're not going to be your clients very long. So there's certainly a case for, all boats rise in a tide, or whatever that phrase is. And like, you make sure you're taking care of them, and then there will be good clients, loyal clients, and everybody's going to win.
Yeah, I know. And I think you've done such a great job at kind of describing all of the different ways, FSP should think about this issue. And Amelia Cade, just to have you kind of add to that, one of the things that has struck us about the Richest Project is that when we've framed child labor within an SPM or client protection lens, this clicks quickly, especially for those working within the financial services sector. And I wonder if you can just share a little bit more on this and kind of the feedback that you've gotten from FSPs when they've looked at the tools or, considered the case that we've been trying to make with the evidence and the development of the toolkit itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Bobby. We've been piloting the tools in a number of contexts, and specifically in Nigeria and the Philippines. What's been really, really interesting is that after reviewing the tools and across other organizations as well, really that the thing they latched on to was when we say that you're just protecting your clients, we're not asking anything beyond that, and we're saying this is part of an SPM framework, then people are very, very comfortable. We know there's hundreds of organizations using the universal standards and using the SPI4, and so kind of couching it within that context. And it hasn't been too much of a stretch when we are expanding that out to households to talk about children and families as well. And so that's been a really important kind of door and what we call part of our push strategy of really putting it within, the certification, as well as really kind of lining up with your social mission, and as well our conversations with investors as well. That's been really, really important to build that buy-in as well, since there is so much buy-in to client protection among investors. The other side, kind of the pull strategy, which also is linked to client protection and SPM, are those organizations where child protection and really the concern for impact for women is really ingrained within the organization's missions, and so that's really been a really great way to also frame the tools as, here are some practical tools that you can use that really measure and really help you show that you are meeting your mission to protect children.
Great. And I think, earlier you had also, started talking a little bit about the caretaking issue that has come up in the research, and that, women's caretaking responsibilities can often be one of the contributors to families resorting to child labor. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about practical ways that you see FSPs engaging themselves in what might be perceived as kind of a social norm issue. Seems kind of outside the scope of what an FSP should be doing, because this is really getting households to change who does what in the household, so that women can, start or grow a business, or, take on a debt, which may require them, to engage in different livelihood strategies to either pay back the loan, et cetera. So I'm just wondering, what is a practical way that organizations can engage around this particular topic, especially for financial service providers?
Great. Yeah. So from our research, what we're seeing is that any increase in a woman's labor burden is going to imply greater risks. And so I think that's an important message for FSPs to understand. One of those risks being child labor, and risks to themselves about how they run their business. And so I think that that's a really important message, that, whatever the additional pressures and activities and meetings, whatever that is going to be a labor burden. And so, absolutely something that needs to be considered. One of the pieces that we're encouraging is to really have a great portfolio of products and services. And so, Amelia G gave some really great examples of how to improve your financial products and services, so that you aren't having aggressive loan techniques, and that you're having, flexible repayment periods. All of those are ways to reduce that pressure and that labor burden on women, but then really having a great set of products that, if, in the case of a shock, are they able to deal with that better because they have a really accessible, easy to use savings product, or a very easy claim system for a microinsurance product that helps them, deal with the aftermath of a health or a natural shock that occurs along those ways. And, in the end, as a minimum, as a basic, what we are talking about is that FSPs really understand the trade-offs that women clients are making using their products and services, whichever ones they may be. There is some sort of a sacrifice that's happening, whether issues at the home, whether children being involved, whether working really long or late hours or in dangerous areas, something is going on. And so in the end, it is our responsibility to know how those products and services ultimately impact women entrepreneurs.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful to think about. And I think Amelia G had mentioned that in her talking points as well, as, some of what the Richest tools are designed to do is help organizations think about, well, what types of questions would you ask clients then, and at what points of time? And can you integrate things into a client satisfaction survey or a monitoring survey that an organization does, or even in impact surveys that maybe happen, one-off every couple of years? But it's our responsibility to ask both the good and the bad. Like, we want to know what is happening in the direction of what we want to achieve, as well as what the trade-offs may be. So that, I think we all have to recognize that we're kind of at the beginning of this discussion. So there aren't a lot of lessons learned outside of the fact that there have been multiple research studies showing that, different financial services. And I know we have a tendency to talk about credit, but the research also shows that cash transfer programs or asset transfer programs and savings groups can also increase the likelihood that child labor happens because of these labor burdens, that women want to grasp an opportunity. And so in order to do that, they have to kind of figure out how to manage these other issues, within the household as well. So I'd like to bring our session to a conclusion. So we started out with the title of the session being called Kids in the Crosshairs. Sounds really dramatic. And, even though we've been joking about, really as a mom having our kids in our hair, especially maybe over the weekend, we also recognize that, especially with the COVID pandemic, there's been a lot of research out there about women negatively being impacted by the pandemic, as they've had, oftentimes they're the ones leaving maybe employment to take care of children that are out of school, or especially in developing countries where many women entrepreneurs are in kind of the informal sector, there's less protection for them. And so they've really had to, think about how they're going to manage their children being out of school or just from the effects of the pandemic. So, to bring this session to a conclusion, I'd like to play a quick game with the two of you ladies, and I'm going to call it child work or child labor. And so I'm going to name an activity, and I want you to tell me if you think it's child labor or child work and why. So the first one I'm going to give to Amelia G at the SPTF. So the activity is cleaning dishes after dinner. Is this child labor or child work?
I am 100% in favor of children doing chores, especially my children doing our chores. So I'm going to vote child work and excellent character development. And if you leave this webinar with any thought, it is, please email Amelia your tips for getting her children to do more chores. That's my answer.
I love it. Amen to that. So Amelia K from Grameen. Doing mom's 9-to-5 job, if we can believe that a job really is just 9 to 5, doing mom's job for her during the work week, child labor or child work?
9 to 5, what is that? As tempting as it sounds, I'm going to say child labor.
Yes, if I could figure out how to get my children to do at least the 9 to 5 part of my job, I'd probably be thrilled. So the last but not least, rubbing mom's feet, and I'll let both of you answer this, child labor or child work?
I think I would get some child works if I asked. I don't know about you, Amelia.
Yeah, I don't know this one. It seems like they're already doing the dishes. I'm already ahead. So
I know, and it might be one they would just complain. We would see it as child work. This is your responsibility as the child to make your mother happy, while they would probably complain it's child labor, right?
Yeah, we can delegate that to the husband. That's okay.
Yeah. But all that's wishful thinking.
Exactly.
I think it's all wishful thinking.
A mom can dream.
Yeah, exactly. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And before we leave, I'd like to, Amelia G from the SPTF, if people have questions about what you talked about today about the universal standards, where might their first touch point be to go to get more information?
Yeah, I think the easiest, we have our website, which is sptf.info. And if you want to email us, it's info@sptfnetwork.org. And I would love to talk to you personally, but that's the easiest email to remember. So info@sptfnetwork.org, and then that person can direct your questions to me. And please do write. I would love to hear from you.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Amelia K from Grameen, how might people learn a little bit more about the Richest Project?
Great. So we have a Richest portal, which is located on the Grameen Foundation website. So feel free to visit grameenfoundation.org/riches. And then also we have an email that comes directly to me and other colleagues at riches@grameenfoundation.org. So also please feel to write us. We have some exciting events and activities coming up in the next couple of months that we'll be sharing really widely what we've learned and a lot about the tools.
Great, thank you. So thank you to everyone who's joined our session today. Between the Amelias, I think it was definitely a challenge to keep these two fantastic ladies, keep them apart today. And Zach, if you're watching and you want to bring us on to Between Two Furs, we're all we're all available,
Ready,
right?
we're ready. You've seen the magic that can happen.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.